Good morning, everybody, and thank you for your patience with us. Despite 4 years of being on Zoom, technological difficulties still persist, but we have straightened them out. So I'm very happy to welcome all of you to our annual Martin Luther King Day of Advocacy. It looks like there are people still joining us. But since we're already late, I do want to get started. Very excited to have you, particularly in this relatively fraught moment. Or I don't know, when is it ever not fraught, I suppose? It's a better question. But we'll talk about this a little bit more as the panel unfolds. But one of the reasons we wanted to focus on asylum is because, as you know, arguments have been raging in Congress. The louder party has been suggesting that our border is out of control, that we're too lenient on asylum seekers, all these other problems. And so we can't do another thing like fund the government or support Israel or Ukraine unless we fix the border. And while that in and of itself has been very distressing because, as you are about to hear, that's not really based on fact. What's almost worse is the media's reporting on what's going on at the border, because they are also contributing to a lot of the confusion. So we wanted to put on a panel today about asylum in particular, and hopefully educate you both about the process and a little bit about what's going on in the border. So I want to take a minute to introduce our panel, and then I'll do a little bit more of an introduction if you'll bear with me. So my name is Catherine Miller-Wilson. I'm the Executive Director of HIAS Pennsylvania. Very happy to be with you all today. And I want to introduce Matthew Egler DiFerdinando, who is a staff attorney at HIAS Pennsylvania. He does asylum and removal defense work and a fair amount of detained work, helping people who are detained. And then Dr. Alisa Gutman, who is a psychologist who's done a number of asylum evaluations pro bono for us. Oh, sorry, PhD, right?
I'm a psychiatrist and I'm an MD
Psychiatrist.
PhD. Yeah.
Psychiatrist. Okay, sorry. She's done a number of pro bono asylum evaluations for us, and she's going to talk a little bit about that process. And then we also have the fortune of having a client of ours, Nenehjoh Mansaray, who received asylum about a year ago. And she has very graciously agreed to share her story of having gone through the asylum process. Kathleen Moyer, our MC, if you will, or I don't know the proper term, has posted in the chat that if you have any questions, please either put them in the chat or raise your hand by going to more reactions, raise hand, which is at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom. So again, welcome. And I want to kind of dive in, expose a few of the myths that have been circulating in the media, and then dive into asking questions of our panelists. So over the last 6 weeks, we've seen increasingly hysterical demands by Congress to get control of our borders. These calls have been amplified by the media, which has posted claims of, quote, I'm quoting here the Philadelphia Inquirer, 250,000 illegal border crossings reported by Custom and Border Patrol, CBP, in the month of December. But that quote was stated just like that, without revealing how these numbers are counted or how border officials are defining quote unquote illegal. In addition, there have been claims that too many people are seeking asylum and that, quote, it is too easy to get asylum. That's all been part of the media coverage of those claiming that increased border security is necessary. What is sadly not covered sufficiently are the number of folks that have been kept from seeking asylum because of relatively new requirements to use an app called CBP-1. This app has proven repeatedly to not work for brown and Black immigrants whose faces are not recognized by the app, and to not work for any immigrant who does not have cell service or who does not have access to a cell phone, a charger, a place to charge their cell phone, or minutes to keep their phone working. There are countless stories that we hear, but which are not well amplified, of asylum seekers who attempt to comply with the rules, but are frustrated by this new app and therefore are forced to cross the border to seek assistance without having gotten through on the app. It is therefore an open question whether these folks' entry to the United States seeking refuge are part of the, quote, 250,000 illegal entries mentioned above. And as for the claims of too many asylum seekers, these are made boldly right next to articles that describe chaos and murder in Haiti, oppression and torture by the Taliban in Afghanistan, war and chaos in Ukraine, rape and military takeover in the Congo, the ongoing war in Israel, devastation caused by the impact of climate change in Iraq, Guatemala, and on and on. The ongoing tone-deaf cries that the United States needs to, quote, discourage those who are fleeing violence, torture, imprisonment, or starvation, as if they would leave their home, their family and friends, and everything they've ever known as a choice rather than a life-saving necessity, is ludicrous. And even more laughable, if the consequences of not getting asylum weren't so profoundly tragic, is the notion that it is, quote, too easy to get asylum. So again, I'm very excited for our guest speakers, practitioners involved firsthand with asylum seekers in the asylum system every day, and a client of ours who received asylum about a year ago. Thank you all again for being here today. Today's event will highlight the real experience of asylum seekers and emphasize towards the end actions that can be taken towards best supporting this population. So let's go ahead and jump into our discussion, and I'm going to start with Matt. So Matt, what defines an asylum seeker?
Yeah, so an asylum seeker, and I think useful to compare asylum seekers and refugees here, because in large part they have a lot in common. Both refugees and asylees are individuals outside of their country who are unable and unwilling to return because of persecution or a fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or something called a particular social group. That's a catch-all that covers things like sexual orientation, family membership, or fear of gangs, all of which come up pretty often. The distinction here is while a refugee will have gone through the approval process prior to entry, so they're coming into the US with refugee status and have the ability to become permanent residents about a year after that. Asylees are seeking refuge in the US for one of these reasons, but are either already here without prior approval or are seeking this at the border. So in practice, for any one of these reasons, an asylee is someone who has come to the US and now has to go through the application process in order to try and meet that standard that refugees have already been approved for having met.
Thank you. So does the granting of asylum differ depending on where in the United States you petition for asylum?
So it shouldn't, right? It's a federal process. This isn't a state-by-state process, but the reality in practice is that it really does. Different asylum offices, and so when someone's applying for asylum, you're either applying through U.S. Immigrations and Customs Services, USCIS, or through an immigration court. And both of these are local procedures, right? So in practice, it really can depend. Different asylum offices have wildly different rates of granting asylum to individuals, just as different immigration courts do. In my own work, especially working with folks who are detained, this can have some really devastating consequences. A good example of this, there used to be a court located in York, Pennsylvania, which was closed within the last few years, and a lot of the clients who were there because of that closure the facility, the detention facility was closed there as well, were moved to Florida or Georgia, where their chance of getting asylum went from difficult but reasonable to almost nearly impossible in those jurisdictions for the cases I was dealing with. So while it shouldn't, in practice, it really does make a difference where you are.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-up on that. You know, the example that you just gave of people transferred to Georgia and Florida where it's almost impossible. How do you know that it's almost impossible? What's the evidence that you have that shows that there's this difference?
Yeah, and when I say it's almost impossible, I don't mean that in a defeatist way, but certainly there's a couple of reasons it becomes much more difficult. So you can look at, there are databases online. I think it's Syracuse University that does a good job of tracking asylum grants at different immigration courts. And so there's good data that reflects what each individual judge and each immigration court does as far as their grant rates go. So that's one thing, looking at the data, and the other reality is just that so the US is split into different circuit courts, and each state, the judges in these immigration courts are bound by the law within those circuits. And so Pennsylvania is in one circuit where immigration law is friendlier to these types of cases than the immigration law in the circuits that Georgia, Florida, or Texas are in. And so part of it is the policies and practices of these individual asylum offices, or the beliefs of immigration judges may differ, but part of it is just these judges are bound by different legal decisions from judges above them in those states.
Thank you. And I guess one more quick question related to that. There's a way, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you can sort of track by asylum officer grant and deny rates. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct as well. I think it's a little easier to find that information based on judge than by asylum officer, but it is possible to find that.
And if you look at judges in Georgia and Florida, the grant rates are very low. Is that right?
Yeah, single digits. It varies by judge, but a lot of the times 5%, 2%, every once in a while 0%, right? So it can be very difficult to win those cases for clients who are moved to those jurisdictions.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I guess this is connected to my next question, which I wanted you to do that thing that lawyers struggle with so much, which is describe in plain language how does one go about seeking asylum?
Yeah. So there's two big categories, or two big ways that folks apply for asylum. Either affirmatively, so through U.S. Customs and Immigration Services, after you've been inspected and allowed into the country, or defensively. So if someone is encountered at the border entering without permission, or they're arrested in the U.S. after entering without permission, their case will be referred to immigration court, and then they're doing what's called a defensive application. I'll walk through both of these quickly, as quickly as I can. The affirmative process, so the process for someone who is admitted as an asylum seeker and not detained, you're filing within the first year of your time in the US, and that's a very important first step to all of this. Within your first year, you're filing an asylum application, along with whatever supplemental evidence you have to support your claim, whether that's letters from your family supporting what you're saying happened or what you fear might happen, police reports, if applicable, medical reports, things like that. You file all of that with USCIS. You will get a biometrics notice. So that's a fingerprinting appointment, basically, soon after you file your application. And then eventually you'll be given an interview with USCIS, with an asylum officer. After that, a decision will be made. USCIS does have the ability, and often will, refer people to immigration court. So not everyone who files affirmatively will ultimately have their decision made by USCIS, but generally speaking, that's how the affirmative process works. The defensive application largely looks the same. The difference is where you're filing it. So rather than filing an application with USCIS, which is a federal agency, other than filing the application, really what you're doing is waiting for an interview. It's not as grueling of a process, I would say, generally speaking. For a defensive application, you're going to court, you're litigating your case. And so this is, again, usually someone who is encountered at the border or who's arrested and put in removal proceedings. In this situation, you're filing your application directly with a judge. You're still filing the same type of evidence, whatever evidence you can have to support your case. The difference here is rather than your case ending with an interview with an asylum officer, it ends with what's called an individual hearing or a merits hearing, which is a trial. It's a trial of your immigration case. You need to testify publicly on the not publicly on the record about your reasons for seeking asylum, and then the immigration judge makes a decision. So those are the two main or the two ways really that individuals will apply for asylum.
Thank you. And just a quick, also related to that whole issue, are there state or federally funded lawyers for every person who is seeking asylum? Like if you can't afford to hire a lawyer?
Yeah, it's a great question, and no. So as I think a lot of people are familiar with, in the criminal context for someone going through a criminal case in the US, citizens have a right to counsel. Non-citizens in the US, although there is a limited right to counsel, which really just covers buying time to try and find a lawyer for the most part, there's no right to an attorney. There are not the same kind of guarantees to get that kind of representation, and it makes a big difference. Now, certain jurisdictions, certain states will provide funding for what effectively look like public defender systems, in the sense that in Pennsylvania, for example, part of an organization or a coalition that our agency is part of, the Pennsylvania Immigrant Family Unity Project, so that's PIFUP, is a collection of attorneys from different nonprofits, the goal of which being to provide universal representation for as many folks who are detained as possible. And PIFUP receives funding from Philadelphia and from Pittsburgh as part of that. But the reality is the funding is nowhere near sufficient to provide representation to the amount of people we want to. So, and that's very much a state by state thing. For the most part, there are not programs like that in most states to provide that. So no, finding an attorney is a large part of this process, and certainly makes a really big difference as the data bears out in terms of success rates.
Thanks. And just a side related note, until 2 weeks ago, Pennsylvania was the only state in the United States that didn't fund public defenders either, lawyers for people who were charged criminally. Every other state provides state funding. Governor Josh Shapiro changed that a couple of weeks ago and did authorize some state money. It's a great first step. It's not nearly enough. But one of the things that's really distressing is that there is money provided on the state level and by the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania for the people that prosecute those crimes. And similarly, in the immigration context, there's money from the federal government to pay for immigration, to prosecute the immigration cases, but no money that is provided to the asylum seeker to obtain counsel. So that's a side note. I know that there's questions in the chat. First one often hears people say immigrants should quote unquote get in line or follow the rules, not just cross the border. Would you explain why asylum seekers are following the rules, and why do they not apply for asylum before they enter the country as refugees do?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think the reality is just that, like a lot of rules, the lived experience of folks doesn't really allow for that kind of discretion or that type of patience. A lot of my clients and a lot of our agency's clients and asylum seekers in general are fleeing situations that are a matter of life and death. And the reality of that is, you can, if the option is to go to a country where you feel like you're going to be safe and feel like you don't have to worry about something happening to you or your family irreversibly, you're going to do what you need to do to survive. And a lot of the asylum application process is a matter of survival. Now, certainly a lot of folks, that's not always the case. And there are folks who can, for one reason or another, go through the process as the US government mandates. But for a lot of folks, it's just a matter of they need to be here, and they'll deal with whatever those consequences are, and that's what attorneys are for. So I appreciate the question. I think it's a difficult one to answer, but I think that's what it comes down to a lot of the time.
Great. And I want to just expand on that. So one of the things, Matt explained that he's representing asylum seekers, which is a different process from how you get refugee status. But this is where the question that Matt was just answering, this is where that difference really comes in. So for a long, long time, I would almost say until Trump was elected president in 2016, but Matt will correct me if I'm wrong, there really weren't rules for asylum seekers. You had a constitutional right to seek asylum once you were on US soil. So you could cross the border at a legal entry point and say to the border official, I am seeking asylum. And then there was a process for the border official to interview the person, and a fairly low standard. If they met that standard, then they were what's called paroled into the country and told you have a year to formally apply for asylum. The refugee process is actually much more prolonged. When you escape from your country of origin because of persecution, as Matt described, and you end up in another country, not the United States, and you seek refugee status, there's a similar kind of questioning that goes on to the questioning that happens at our border, like I described. But then once it's decided that you are in fact a refugee, then there's a decision to be made about where you will be resettled. And if the decision is that you will be resettled in the United States, then you have to go through the United States' security vetting process, which since 9/11 is the most rigorous in the world, is a 10-step time-sensitive process. And you have to wait in wherever you are, in a refugee camp or in an urban environment where you're not a citizen and you don't have rights, to go through that process, which can take as long as 10 years. And sometimes the people that have fled and have escaped their country are pursued into the new country. So they keep fleeing. I encountered a client recently who that happened to. So they fled from Afghanistan to Qatar, and then there were still threats. They got wind that some Taliban were chasing them across borders. So they ultimately ended up coming to Central America and then working their way up through the southern border because it was safer for their family. So there's a lot of reasons why asylum seekers end up being asylum seekers instead of refugees, one of which is because the danger is ongoing, another of which might be because they don't want to sit in a camp for 20 years. They want to kind of try to resume their life. So, and there was nothing illegal or problematic with that until there started being imposed these various restrictions on how you could enter the border. And one of them was the way that I described in the opening, in the introduction to this panel discussion, which is the use of this app, which doesn't always work. So So that was a kind of longer, more detailed response, but I want everybody to know the fuller context. There's another question in the chat, Matt, if you know this, why was the York, Pennsylvania facility closed? Why did states like Florida or Georgia get these asylum seekers rather than other more balanced immigration states? Do you think that this is a way to eliminate them under the radar in this political climate? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll answer the York part of it first. And there's two sides to that. So part of it is that there had been for years a on the ground community-based movement to try and have the York facility closed. A lot of really great agencies did a lot of great work on that. And that was certainly part of the reason it closed. The administrative reality of it is the contract expired. So like a lot of these facilities where individuals are detained, like most of them away from the border itself, ICE had contracted with York County to rent space at the York County prison, basically, to detain individuals. And that contract was expiring, and certainly part of it was the public pressure, I would imagine, from the coalition seeking to close it. And part of it is that the county decided not to continue with that contract. So that's why that was closed. As far as why people were transferred to Florida and Georgia, this gets into the problematic discretion that ICE has with the control of the lives of folks who are in detention in particular, because there wasn't one uniform transfer made. There were people transferred to Florida and Georgia. There were also people transferred, smaller numbers, to Massachusetts and Rhode Island and other places in Pennsylvania, with really no explanation given for when, why, anything like that. So there were some cases where it felt like it was done maliciously. I think I can feel safe saying I had a client, probably the best example of this, a client who had been in detention in New York for close to a year, was prepping for his trial, his merits hearing, which was set on, this is early July of that year. And on the day of his hearing, so he's been prepping for this for about a year, that morning he was transferred down to Georgia. And there's no real way to correct that, right? I filed whatever petitions I could with the judge to try and have the case heard remotely in Pennsylvania, but there wasn't really any turning back from that, and he didn't win that case in large part because of where he was. So yeah, I think you won't lose money betting on ICE to have bad intent with these individuals on the whole, right? So I think there's probably something to your question as far as that goes, but in large part it was a chaotic time and sort of difficult to tell why people were being moved to where they were being moved to.
Thank you. Another question in the chat. If immigration is regulated at the federal level, why are immigration judges in some states limited in their abilities by decisions made by higher state courts?
Yeah, so I think the limiting decisions are, for the most part, are federal decisions. So they're coming from federal circuit courts. So you will sometimes see immigration judges are largely limited by state decisions when it comes to things like criminal law. So a lot of the individuals who, and this is especially in the detained context, but it happens in the non-detained context as well. If someone has a Pennsylvania conviction, there are certain ways that needs to be handled at an immigration level versus if someone has the same conviction from a Florida case, depending on how the laws are written, and it's not really worth getting into the weeds of that too much, but basically depending on how laws are written in different states and how those laws match up with the federal definition of the same crime, they can have different consequences in federal court. So that is, in practice, the biggest way that state laws or state decisions will impact those judges, but in large part, the decisions that a Florida judge is bound by aren't Florida state decisions. They are federal decisions in the circuit that Florida is a part of. So I hope that answers that question, because yeah, that's confusing.
Great. One more question, and then I'm going to switch to Dr. Gutman. So what is the status of weight in Mexico?
Yeah, so weight in Mexico and Title 42, which are different programs, but had similar consequences, right? The Title 42, which is had expired in May of this past year. And so that was obviously something that was in the news for a long time, had really devastating consequences on a lot of people. At this point, so that was a COVID era restriction, right? And based on theoretically sort of the public health necessities, things like that, right? But at this point, the process for someone entering the US filing at the border is under Title 8 again, which is what it had been prior to that. So the Wait in Mexico program, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Kathy, this isn't something I deal with as much, but my understanding is that the Supreme Court, I think this was also last year, but permitted the Biden administration to terminate that Trump era program. So
yes,
my understanding is it's not in practice anymore.
Right, that is correct. But I think you were right to raise it in the chat, because it's one of the things that's been floating around again in this congressional raging debate. Oh, let's go back to that, because it was so great to have thousands of people waiting with no shelter, no food, and no nothing, and vulnerable to kidnapping and robbery and assault. And clearly I'm being sarcastic, just to be clear. Zoom is a little weird. So anyway, so right now it's not a policy, but it is being debated again, which is very upsetting. So thank you very much. I want to turn now to Dr. Alisa Gutman. And again, thank you for joining us. So Dr. Gutman, tell us, what is the Human Rights Clinic and what do you do?
So Philadelphia Human Rights Clinic is a medical student-run asylum clinic that is here in the Philadelphia area. So we were founded in, actually it began as Penn Human Rights Clinic, which I founded with a group of medical students at Penn when I was actually still in training there many years ago. And then in 2012, we became Philadelphia Human Rights Clinic when we had a group of medical students from another institution come and ask us if they could be involved. So we kept the logo, changed the name to Philadelphia Human Rights Clinic, so PHRC. And what we are is a medical student run pro bono clinic to provide medical evaluations for asylum seekers for their asylum cases. We are the second that was formed when Physicians for Human Rights started developing really close partnerships with medical school faculties and students. And so we formed just after Weill Cornell, just a few months after they formed one. And we do trainings locally for training physicians, psychologists, and social workers on how to do forensic evaluations of asylum seekers for immigration court.
Great. And so how do asylum seekers come to you?
So we get cases either directly through Physician for Human Rights, who sends cases to our medical student board, or we have cases come to us from local immigration attorneys. Our first partnerships, unsurprisingly, were with HIAS and with NSC, so our two refugee agencies that work so closely with the immigration populations in Philadelphia. I think the thing that's really special about PHRC, in comparison actually to other clinics around the country, we're the only clinic that is run by medical students from many institutions. So, as anyone who's in the medical world in Philadelphia knows we have many medical schools. So there's 5 on land that are in Philadelphia proper. And we have students on a shared executive board. The medical students work together from all of those 5 schools. It's actually the only clinic that does that in the city, where all the schools are working together. It's really something to see these bright, young, budding physicians working in this capacity.
That's terrific. So, what are the biggest challenges in engaging in a asylum evaluation?
The challenge for engaging in the evaluation really is just access, I would say. And so, as I stated, for how asylees come to us, we are only working with clients who have an attorney already, and that's not the norm. It's why we are a pro bono clinic. So the attorneys who work with us either are working pro bono, some are working low bono. And so we, as an ethic, do these evaluations for free. But it's a challenge to get to an attorney in the first place, and then a challenge to then get to us.
Right, right. And so important. And so what, I guess it's hard to figure out how to articulate this question, but what is the importance of a psych evaluation to an asylum seeker's case? I mean, right, if you think about how Matt explained the definition, persecution based on one of those 5 reasons. So just say, for example, that somebody says that they were persecuted for political reasons, then you, as a layperson, I would assume, okay, so you just tell the facts, right? They're of the X political party, and the Y political party, gained power, and then they went after them, right? Like, what do you need an evaluation for?
Yeah, so I can't understate this. So in immigration court, Matt was already giving us the groundwork to understand that these are not citizens of the United States. They have very little protections under the US Constitution, although they do have some. And so in this case, I would say in most cases, most asylum evaluation, most asylees don't come with this like carefully crafted letter by either their government or say by a group that their government was unable or unwilling to protect them from, that says, we're so sorry we tortured you. Yes, it was definitely you. Here's a picture of you and your ID to corroborate, and you can go and use this in asylum court in another country. So instead, people come with whatever they're wearing. They come without money. They come without means, and they come just with stories. And so then that goes to the next layer, that in many cases, when we're talking about individuals who've experienced torture in their home country, modern torture often does not leave scars. So police and military and paramilitary organizations who abduct and torture civilians from their home countries don't use generally techniques that would bear scars. Some do, which is why we train physicians to evaluate for certain kinds of scarring. But most you employ methods that are scarless. And so as it turns out, the human mind is often the only place where a scar can be found. And so in addition to doing physical evaluations, evaluating for different kinds of scarring or different kinds of neurological deficits, it's very important for many asylum seekers to have their narrative corroborated by having a psychiatric or a psychological report that can document the consistency. So I do that for Matt. So for the attorney, I will be opining on whether the story that I'm hearing is consistent with the medical findings in front of me, and perhaps with any psychiatric diagnosis that I find, if that's the case. And so that then can be used as evidence in court. So many times the only evidence that an asylum seeker has, because they don't have that handy dandy letter from their torturer saying they were tortured, many times the only evidence that they're able to present is medical evidence. And in any court in the US, medical evidence is considered evidence. So once I am determined to be an expert in the courtroom, then the evaluation that I'm presenting is considered evidence for court.
Thank you. And that's That's really a great way. I've never heard that before, but scars in the mind. That's a really helpful way to think about it. So thank you for that. Um, so, um, so what are some main takeaways that you'd like people to focus on from this discussion?
Yeah, so um, I think what's incredibly important for anyone to know is don't stay silent. So when you are someone who knows this information, and you can speak against the powerful fear-based rhetoric that is ablaze in the country, um, currently, to contribute to a truthful narrative. So just to think through, and I will do a small trigger warning, I won't be giving details, but to think through the most recent cases that I evaluated as a psychiatrist for to write forensic reports. So most recent person I evaluated was a mother who was I evaluated her on 2 occasions, because on the first occasion she didn't have childcare available for her young daughter. And so it was a bit of a limited evaluation. And then I saw her again. She had a really, she had had female genital cutting done in her home country when she was a child. It was for her a horrific experience, and she was incredibly fearful that upon forced return, her daughter would have the same, and fearful because that is what would have happened. Her daughter in her home country was actually considered property of another woman, because of the way that the marriage was arranged. Another evaluation I did recently was a man who was abducted as a child, forced to be a child soldier, forced to, had horrific acts upon him. Again, I don't talk to people on the best day of their life, so just warning. But this is a person who, as a young boy, was raped by multiple grown men, and then as an adult, had been able to get himself here into the US to find safety. I've evaluated teenage girls who were aware that one girl in particular who I think of, who was telling me all about her dreams of college and was fully aware that if she were forced to return to her home country, she was going to be a child bride. These are real people. These are not numbers. These are not clients. These are not people presenting at the border trying to ruin the US. These are just me and you. The reason that I'm here today wearing my Bubby's drop pearl is because my family was resettled by HIAS after the Holocaust. My mother is a Holocaust survivor. So these are Americans. We are all these people. And some are coming with these horrific stories. And bearing those scars, many are coming with resilience. So it's really incumbent on any of us who know the truth to be an upstander, to be speaking loudly. And when you hear people say incorrect, false narratives, to be incredibly vocal. We all have a different style for this, and we know that we're not going to be able to combat someone's anger with anger. I use a particular brand of smiling and gentle shaming in these circumstances. I highly recommend it. And the way that that might look is to say, oh, wait, just a moment. What you were saying, actually, that's not quite true. And giving some narratives, because human beings are narrative based. We believe things when we hear about them, when we know people. And that's how we make change. So for me, the whole why is tikkun olam. I can use that in a room like this, in a Jewish agency room. So it's all about world repair. And the way that any of us can do world repair is by speaking up.
That's great. You know, I want to follow up, go off script a little bit and follow up from my own experiences. Prior to coming to HIAS Pennsylvania, I represented parents accused of abuse and neglect, most of whom had been victims of trauma themselves, either by foster parents or relatives or strangers, and as a result had ended up in addiction and all kinds of stuff, and then had difficulty parenting their children. And I noticed, I'm a lawyer. I have no psychological training at all, but I did notice this pattern about time. My clients really struggled with time, both as they narrated what had happened to them. They were clearly very confused about what happened when, but also in the present. So if we made an appointment for 9, they would show up at 11 and think it was 9, not say, oh, I mixed up the time, but they were confused. And this happened repeatedly. I mean, not just, one client. And then also false narratives, which I got sort of well practiced in gently untangling. And so I wonder if you could speak to, again, this really struck me, your comment about scars in the mind and what that does to dates and time, and quote unquote falsehoods, right? How do we process trauma? Is this a common thing, or is this just something that happened in my experience, or,
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, and it's one that requires me to do a bit of an extra deep dive into nerddom. So I studied. I am a psychiatrist, as I said. I'm a physician. I also have a PhD in neuroscience, and I studied memory. So the question you're asking, I think, is really relevant. And it's how does our perception of time change, perhaps, after experiencing significant traumatic incidents. And so it sounds to me like the clients that you were working with were in periods of ongoing significant stress. And if everyone in the room goes behind you and remembers something from high school science, you will remember fight or flight. So everyone remembers fight or flight, right? Actually fight, flight, freeze, or tend and befriend, but who's counting? So when fight or flight is happening, in that moment, so for the people you were working with, they were probably experiencing really high levels of that fight or flight hormone, adrenaline, and also probably really high levels of cortisol, which is released when we're stressed. It's an adrenal hormone. And when someone has a high amount of cortisol running through their blood, they can't remember things. And so their inability to recall or really have a sense of time is probably related to that in those moments. It's a bit complicated, but in the way you're describing that, it's probably extreme stress in that moment. There's another phenomena about the memory itself that can get disrupted when at the time of a memory formation, someone's really, really stressed out. So in that case, you actually tend to form your memories really, really well, but sometimes disjointed. So you'll have a really, really clear, really sensory driven. If anyone in the room has ever talked to somebody with a significant trauma memory, you can prompt them, they'll remember what things looked like. They'll give you almost incredibly awesome, vivid detail of the looks, the smells, the tastes, how things felt, what temperature things were in the room. And so those memories are really, really strong, really well-formed memories, but they can be really difficult to access properly. So you're seeing a couple of different stress-based phenomena happening probably simultaneously. But if you think about when you're going to take you can go back again, perhaps for most of us to high school science, when you're really, really nervous to take a test, you tend to have a really high level of cortisol. And if you're too nervous, you fail the test because you can't remember a darn thing. If you hit the sweet spot of nervousness, I'm probably in the sweet spot when I'm giving talks like this, that I'm remembering things like nobody's business. A little bit of stress is really good and drives memory, but too much and you just fail. So they probably get confused in time with that amount of stress.
That's great. And it just, I think I appreciate that, because again, that feeling about looking for scars in the mind, I feel like it's so important, because someone who isn't knowledgeable, and it kind of circles back to the importance of what you do, you hear stories and there's inconsistent details or time frames that don't make sense. And I think the instinct of the listener is to say, well, clearly it's not true. It doesn't add up, right? And I think what you're doing is uncovering enough of the details so that you can put together, you can help the client tell their story.
That's right. And you're bringing up and yet another thing about memories when someone has a trauma. One of the things, this isn't what I always diagnose or even usually diagnose, but sometimes a particular person will have post-traumatic stress disorder. And one of the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder is having a disjointed memory of the event. And so what we often are doing is helping someone put things in a straight line. One of the techniques that I use when I do asylum evaluations is I write out a timeline based on the client's affidavit that I've reviewed before I see them. And then I have them sit usually next to me and we look at it together and like, when did that happen? When did this happen? And try to put things back in a straight line when memories like that are often nonlinear.
Yeah, and I feel personally reaffirmed because what you were saying about things, smell and taste. I learned as a lawyer that if I wanted to get the timeline, I would say things like, do you remember, was it cold? Was it before or after Christmas? I would try to pick out something that I thought the client would remember so that they could then place the event before or after or during.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that was very helpful.
Yes, you're on your way to being a psychotherapist, I think. That's wonderful.
So great. Okay, some questions in the chat. And actually, if you will all bear with me, I'm going to answer this one question. What is the real situation application of the Philly law to prohibit hospitals from deporting very ill asylum seekers? So I was involved in testifying for passage of the bill. And so I want to, and we're very excited and grateful to the Philadelphia City Council that they did pass it. So just to kind of unpack a little bit about what was behind that. So to our horror, and the R here is kind of the immigration serving community at large. We began to hear of deportations paid for by hospitals. And so and kind of skipping legal process. And basically what it would be is someone who didn't have insurance, who was undocumented, meaning either they were simply undocumented or they were in process for documentation, which it's one of the many horrors of U.S. immigration law is that while you're waiting, you're still considered undocumented. So anyway, so either way, you'd be admitted to the hospital for something very serious. Maybe a car accident that resulted in a coma, maybe a heart attack, some very, very serious emergency that then required somewhat prolonged care. Maybe you were in a coma and you're not coming out of the coma. You don't have insurance. So the hospital started essentially dumping people. So they would, with their own money, much of which came from the feds, because hospitals are federally funded, pay for charter planes and simply deport people in a coma back to their country of origin, which is so wrong on so many levels. Happily, this was not a common thing in Philadelphia, but there was an attempt by Jefferson to do this to someone. And community-based advocates got wind of it, put up a huge protest, managed to stop the deportation, and managed to find emergency Medicaid, that this gentleman who was going to be deported was in fact eligible for emergency Medicaid. And they got him the emergency Medicaid. And so with that, he was then discharged to a rehab facility, not deported and taken care of. So that was great that the community was able to get, band together so quickly, but clearly it was horrifying that they even had to do that. So they worked on a bill, which is a very important bill, saying that Philadelphia hospitals are simply not allowed to do this. And that bill passed and was almost unanimous. And so that's a really good thing. To be clear, and I see somebody in the chat is raising this, and it's an important point. That gentleman, as well as anyone in the future, they're still at risk of deportation through the legal process, right? Because that gentleman was undocumented. So it's still a problem. And if you can get an attorney, great. But as we heard earlier, it's not so easy to get an attorney. So there's still problems. But I do think it's really important that the hospitals get sent the strong signal that they did, that like, you cannot do this. You are supposed to be caring for the people that are admitted and not deporting them to their death, which is essentially what they're doing, deporting someone who's in a coma, who's low income, and who has fled their country. So that's the story with that bill. Obviously, there's so much more work to be done. We would like similar bills in other counties in Pennsylvania. We'd love a statewide rule, and we would love universal representation. So there you go. Also, world peace while we're at it. But that little piece is at least solved in Philadelphia. And then there's another comment in the chat, which I'll share. Prolonged severe trauma is known to create a state of hyperexcitability in the brain that specifically damages the region of the brain most responsible for memory, right? So just to add to what Dr. Gutman already shared with us, which is very helpful. So thank you so much. I want to turn to our client, who I know she was having some technical difficulties. I hope she is here. Her name is Nenehjoh Mansaray. Oh, are you here?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
Good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry about the technical difficulties, but you can hear me okay. Is that correct?
Yes, I can now. It's
great.
Okay.
That's great. So I hope you were able to hear the asylum process described by our lawyer and the doctor who have helped others like yourself. But we know that you lived it, and we're very appreciative of your willingness to share your story. So can you tell us a little bit about what caused you to leave your country?
I just want to say thank you to you all for having me here and to give me this opportunity to be able to tell a little bit of my story. Pretty much all the questions you asked me, Kathy, has already been answered by both the first and second speaker. So I was just laughing throughout the process. But as the first speaker mentioned, a lot of people come in the United States based on different things and different situations. And my cause for seeking asylum in the United States was based on a social group, which was under the FGM, the female genital mutilation. And sometimes people just see FGM as the cutting, but there are different areas that we have to deal with FGM. Basically, FGM, where I came from, is just like a secret society, where cutting is involved, but there's more to it that meets the eye. Wherein you have people who are responsible to do this are called the SOE members, and you guys are kept in a room for a period of time. You're not going out for like a month or two, and they have all those things they teaching you. So sometimes it's very traumatic for women or girls to go through the situation. So I pretty much went through all this. And it got to a point where I'm like, I can't keep doing this, because if I had to face a situation wherein I've undergo FGM and I have to go through being a SOE member because my grandmother wants to make me become one, I'm not going to do that, because one, I'm educated, so I ought to know better and to know what I want for myself. And these things, you can't keep speaking on them, because if you do, you're going to be at the risk of either getting threats, or worse, losing your life, or worse, something bad happening to you. So this was basically my story, and this is why I left my home country, Sierra Leone, to come to the United States, because I was fearing for my life, because I feel like if I keep talking about this, it's, going to be bad for me. So.
Yeah, no, I very much appreciate that. And I appreciate, again, your willingness to share your story. So tell us a little bit, if you will, about your journey here. You heard the other speakers talk about, some people flee to Europe or to Africa, and then others to Central America, and then make it up to the southern border. What was your journey like? Where did you go?
Fortunately for me, when I left my country, I came straight here because I was able to meet with people who were able to help out with me securing a visa and coming to the United States. And once I get in here, I was able to file in my application, So it was a tough journey. It was not easy, because every day you have to fear for your life. Every day you have to hide. You don't know what the next day gonna bring. You don't know what's gonna happen. You don't know who's gonna see you. It's like you're constantly fleeing. Even in your home country, you're fleeing from one place to another, one region to another, just to be able to get to a place where you'll be safe. So I'm just thankful to those people and forever be grateful to them, because once they heard my story, they were able to come in and help.
That's great. It's interesting that you had said flee from one place in your country to another before leaving your country. As I understand it, that's one of the questions you had to answer, right? That every asylum seeker has to talk about, well, did you try to go live somewhere else? Like, if your village was a problem, did you go to a different village?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
it's not,
Yeah, so it's not easy because you can't just say, well, I was in danger. You have to have tried, right, other parts of the country, which is different in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then one more clarifying question, and then I see there's a question in the chat. You had mentioned that you got a visa here. People helped you. You got a visa to come here directly, and then you applied for asylum. So just to clarify, that visa was not asylum, right?
No, it was not, because of sometimes, just like people, the first and second speaker mentioned earlier, because of the time it takes and the process is too much. So the only way you can be able to leave is if you can get help that can make you get to the United States. You just have to accept that, because sometimes when you talk to people, when things happening in your life that are very life threatening, I believe you just don't go to the United States Embassy and say, oh, I feel like I'm unsafe, I need a visa to go. They don't do that. But
Right.
people hearing your story and, trying to reach out and trying to get the help you need, everybody basically brings ideas like how to help you or how to get you away from this problem as fast as possible. even when we get here in the United States, we want to seek asylum. There are various options that we have. You have to tell your story. You have to say why you're here, or you know, what do you think? What way can we help? You know what I mean? So with this, you're able to get what you think you can get. And at this time, you get to a point where in the decision making, you make decisions, yes, but when you're in a life-threatening situation, some decisions that are being made for you, you're just like, I need to go, I need to be safe. If this is the best option, I just need to take it.
Right, right. So the question in the chat, are you still in touch with your family, in whoever might still be in your country of origin?
Yes, fortunately, all my husband is here. My kids have joined me, so which is very amazing. All of them are able to come in the United States, and I'm thankful for that. And I'm very happy because we're here now as a family. I don't have to worry about, oh, my kids are there, or my husband is there, or something. So all of them are in the United States here, but I was in touch with them every day before they come here.
So you had to flee by yourself and then send for them?
Yes.
So I imagine that was pretty difficult.
I know. It was. Sally would tell, because I'm calling her like every day and night is like rapid firing, I'm calling because you don't know what people are going through. You're here, you're thinking, and it's pretty much stressful for us too that are here because when you're here, you're fighting to survive, you're fighting to get a life for yourself, you're fighting to build something for your family. At the same time, you're worrying for them. So it's hard, you know?
Very much so. I'm a mom myself, and I can't imagine being forced to kind of leave kids behind. And just to clarify, you mentioned Shalu, and just for the audience, Shalu Joes is a legal representative who runs a program for people like Miss Mansaray who already have legal status, but have more legal paths to take on their journey. Because what a lot of people don't realize is that getting asylum is not the end of the road. Then you wait a year, and then you can do what's called adjust your status to become a permanent resident, and that allows you to petition for family members. So I assume, Ms. Mansaray, that's what Shalu did, is adjust your status and then file a family petition for you?
Yes, exactly, yes.
Great. And so the family petition that she filed, it also took, how long did it take, if you remember, before you got your family?
It took a little bit of, like the time frame for my asylum, I think my asylum application started in 2016, and I went for an interview at the asylum office in New Jersey, in Newark, in 2018. That was when my asylum was granted. I waited 2018 to 2023 for me to be able to get my status adjusted and petition for my family. And mind you, during that time, I already started the petition process. It was only in 2003 that I was able to, that my family finally get to be here in the United States with me in September of 2023.
Wow. So 5 years. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a pretty much long time and long but the only thing I am thankful for and I'm grateful for was the support that I was able to get from HIAS and some of those legal representatives that were working with me on my case. Because sometimes when you're going through this stuff, it's really, really stressful. If you don't have the support that you need to get, it will break you. Because you don't know what the next thing is. You don't know what your future holds in the United States. Yes, you might have your your work permit, you might be working and all this stuff. But you're constantly worried what's gonna happen, what's gonna be the next thing for you or your family members. So I just want to say and give the shout out to all the people in HIAS helping people like us to be where we are today and be able to share our story. Because without them, I believe for me personally, it wouldn't be possible to sit here today and just say, oh, this is what happened, you know?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. And and I think it goes without saying. So would you describe the asylum process as too easy?
No, it's not easy. I think the asylum process is one of the most difficult things for us asylum seekers here. Firstly, you have to retell your story every time because it's not one person that have to deal with your case. You have different people that have to deal with you from one different place to another. So it's not easy. Also, you're looking at the time frame, like you mentioned earlier. Just because you've been here and seeking asylum doesn't you're still illegal. If you're not granted asylum, you're still illegal. So you don't know how long it's gonna take. You don't know when it's gonna be, and you don't know if you're gonna end up in an immigration court or if you're just gonna be approved at once. Fortunately for me, when I went for the interview and submitted everything, and the asylum officer took a look at it, I was fortunate to be granted asylum after that interview. What about some people who are not granted asylum at that time? They have to appear in front of an immigration judge. So all this thing is not an easy thing. It takes a lot. You have to think, you have to worry, you have to. It's not an easy process.
Yeah, no, thank you. And then there's one more part of that question in the chat, which is tell us a little bit about your experience once you arrived in the United States. You talked about the asylum process, and it's terrible. So thank you for sharing. But how was how was it getting accustomed to life in the USA? Was it culturally what you expected, what you didn't expect, what surprised you, what challenged you?
Well, I didn't know what to expect, and I would just say it was just a bunch of mixed feeling and mixed reaction. Because once you arrive at custom, you start to think, are they gonna send me back? And this is my first time coming to the United States, and it's scary because you have to think, oh, is this gonna happen? What's gonna be the next move, or are they gonna send me back? And then you standing there in front of the custom officer asking you all these questions and looking at your paperwork and stuff. It's terrifying because you don't know what to expect. And one thing we have to remember is I've come to realize that most of this immigration stuff from the United States Embassy up to USCIS or wherever, or even custom officers at the border control, it's based on personal discretion. Sometimes they look at it, if they don't feel like it's this, they just say, oh, okay, I think this is it, even if it's true or not. So that poses a big challenge to people like me because if somebody is saying this is me and somebody is using their own personal discretion to say, well, this is how I feel based on their own training and stuff, it makes you worry. It makes you think something else, and fear. But like
No,
I said, I'm just thankful to get the opportunity to come here, even though there are challenges, but I was able to overcome with the help of people who understand and who listens to me. Because if you don't have people like that in your corner, it's really, really frustrating.
yeah, no, I really appreciate Miss Mansaray, you're bringing out the point about discretion. Um, And I guess I'm going to jump around a little bit, if you forgive me, and call on Matt again to talk a little bit about that in terms of what that means. And just to give you a little law school 101 background, in law school, we learn about what's called black letter law, case law, and then discretion, right? And so black letter law is kind of what does the law say, right? What we all think about. Case law is what are the interpretations of that law. And then discretion, there are lots and lots of laws where there are pieces of them that they say, okay, and this part is up to the discretion of the judge, right? And so, Matt, tell us a little bit about asylum law and discretion. So,
Yeah, it is a big part of the process. And so I think kind of the important distinction here, so there's asylum, and then there are two types of relief that are similar to asylum called withholding of removal and then relief under the Convention Against Torture. It's basically a sliding scale from best to worst case from asylum to relief under the Convention Against Torture. Whether or not someone's eligible for those things in large part depends on whether they filed their application in their first year here or if they have some kind of bar that prevents them from filing for asylum. So if you qualify for relief under the Convention Against Torture, or if you meet the withholding standard, and those are more difficult standards to meet, it's non-discretionary. So the judge isn't allowed to deny your application. Within asylum law, there is a extremely wide amount of discretion afforded to judges to deny applications if even you can have as many positive factors and reports, evaluations presented, and if the judge just kind of doesn't feel like it, they can deny your application. And, this factors on some level into the fact that immigration judges are federal employees. They're not judges in the constitutional sense. They're not regulated the same way that federal judges are, and that affords them with, from my perspective, a pretty ridiculous amount of discretion to deny clear cases. So it's a difficult part of the process and a reality that I think is difficult to understand for folks who are learning about this.
thank you. It's really, when you put together what you said with Miss Mansaray said, and then also I want to bring everybody, recall that earlier Matt was telling us about the different grant rates across the country, right? Now, does it make a little bit more sense, right? If the judges have discretion, that's sort of, in my opinion, personal, another word for bias, right? Because you have the discretion to decide how you want. And so how you want is what you think is fair, what you think is right, not necessarily what a law says. And so yeah, and you've seen, firsthand, Miss Mansaray shared with us what that feels like, which I really appreciate your sharing with us, because I think it's a really important point that gets missed by a lot of people, lawyers and non-lawyers alike, don't realize how much discretion is involved, which circles back to the other big question, what whether the asylum process is easy. Well, that very much, on top of everything else that you've heard, that very much depends on the judge because of the discretion. So thank you. There was another question in the chat, back to Ms. Mansaray. Do you feel part of the USA now? And do you feel like you've found a welcoming community?
Yes, definitely. I do feel part of the USA because I am contributing to society here because I do work and I'm paying my taxes, which is very much important, and I'm working on myself. And the work I do is to help other people. I work in the healthcare where I work with people with intellectual disability. I'm doing my best every day to provide services to these people. So I believe one way or the other, I am able to contribute to society in the United States. And I know I have a community that is ready to support me anytime on anything or any venture I'm ready to take.
Great. It's wonderful. All right. So before we move on to our advocacy part of the program, I just want to know from you, Ms. Mansaray, if there's anything else you want to share with our listeners, really anything at all that you'd like us to know.
Pretty much, I think I've exhausted everything, and all the speakers have said everything that was on my mind. So I just want to thank the speakers also for being here and listening to our stories. And I believe they have a great role to play too because they going to share the stories with people too who don't know about the process or who just think asylum seekers are here to take their jobs or here to just depend on state benefits or something, because they have to understand asylum seekers can contribute to society too, because we can work, we are hard workers, we pay our taxes, and we help people too. So I just hope some of the narrative that is being put out there about asylum seekers just coming to the United States, all those things, people will be educated and just learn how to be acceptance and know that we're human beings like them and we're here for a reason. Nobody wants to leave home. Nobody wants to leave their comfort zone, you know. Leaving your home country, coming here is a lot of change. You change how you dress, you change how you talk, you change what you eat, you know. So it's a lot.
No, that's so helpful. And again, we're really, really appreciative of your willingness to share your story. I know that it's hard, you know, it's your experience. And as you said, you've already had to share it 50 times to get asylum. And nobody wants to keep saying that, but it makes a difference to people here to really know and understand that the asylum process is really difficult, that you don't leave because it seems like a good idea at the time, and that, you know, you had real reason to need sanctuary. So again, very much appreciate you and our other panelists. So in the last half hour, we don't want to leave people on the depressing note of asylum is really hard and everything is terrible and there is no world peace. We want to feel like we are able to make changes from what we learned today. So we're going to do some letter writing. And before we do, I'm going to talk to you about why that's important. And then we can stay together and write our letters together, or you can write your letter and drop it in the mail and just send us an email to let us know you did that, so we can give you a shout out. Woo! So let me just give my wrap, and I apologize in advance to anyone who's already heard me say this 5,000 times. But writing to your congressional representatives, as well as your state representatives when it's relevant, but today we're going to write to our congressional representatives, is really, really, really critical. It definitely feels like you're shouting into the wind, and I am sympathetic with that. And I know many of you were very, very active in writing to your representatives during the Trump years. And so again, I know it can feel like you're shouting in the wind, but I like to tell my favorite story to give you hope that people really are listening. So first, before the story, let me tell you a little bit about process. Every representative has a staff person whose job it is to tally the phone calls and letters that they get by issue. And they do that every single day. And at the end of the week, the representative goes to the staffer and says, okay, so how many did we get, on healthcare, how much on taxes, how much on immigration, how much whatever. And they use that tally to govern the issues that they're going to prioritize. And one of the reasons that this debate that is raging now has gone so far, despite the fact that it's totally anti-American, anti-humanitarian, anti our economic needs, anti you can go down the list, is because people don't really call or write about immigration in enough volume. And you can understand that, right? Because voters are not immigrants. So once you become a citizen and you can be a voter, then you can write to your congressperson. But then the tendency, understandably, is to ask about healthcare or taxes or the things that directly impact you. Once you're a citizen, immigration doesn't directly impact you anymore. So it's very hard to get people to do enough phone calling and letter writing to get that congressperson to know that it's really a major issue, that we really care. So that's why it's so important. Now, the story part, which is nonfiction, is that in 2017, right before July 4th, there was a Republican president and an all Republican Congress, and all they wanted to do was repeal Obamacare. And really, there was nothing to stop them. Republican president, Republican Congress, that's it, right? I mean, they were all hell-bent on repealing Obamacare before, or the ACA, which is the formal name of it, Affordable Health Care Act, before the July 4th recess. And healthcare advocates around the country were so good at bombarding congressional offices saying, don't do this. And they did it so much, they tied up phone lines, fax lines, they wrote letters, they sent emails, and there was so much voting constituent pressure that they left for the recess, having left the Affordable Care Act intact. Which, when you think about it, again, a Republican president who wanted the Affordable Care Act to be repealed and all Republican Congress who wanted it to be repealed, it's a miracle, right? But it's really important because you see the power of constituent voices made a difference. They said, we don't want this. Don't do this in our name. And so they didn't. So I like to tell that story to give people hope that you're not screaming into the wind. So in the chat, we've put links that you can use to find your representatives and write them a letter. Now let's talk about what does the letter need to say. So there you have choices. Yay. So choice number one, which I'm putting as number one because sometimes it can be easier to talk about a specific thing. There is a House Bill 1325, which I will put in the chat. And hopefully my fabulous assistants behind the scenes can put a link to so you could see the text. But that is the Work Authorization for Asylum Seekers Act. There is a Senate version, but the Senate version is much more draconian. And in either case, there are two versions. They're not a law yet. We would like this to become a law. What it would mean is that if you are petitioning for asylum, you would get work authorization right away instead of 6 months later. You heard Ms. Mansaray talk about how difficult things were even after she filed, because she was still undocumented, still wasn't able to work, because right now the law makes you wait 6 months. That's ridiculous on so many levels. I mean, first of all, how are you supposed to eat and put a roof over your head when you're not eligible for public benefits and you can't work? Second of all, we have staffing crises in every industry. So it really doesn't make sense that we're keeping people who want to work from working when all we need are people to work. So, there's population declines for the last 2 decades. There's demographic information that shows that we're kind of losing people rapidly because the baby boomers are passing away and there aren't other people to replace them. So on every level, moral, economic, political, we need immigrants, and we need immigrants who are stable, not vulnerable, able to work, et cetera. So this bill is one way to help make that happen, at least for asylum seekers. So you can write a letter or an email or a postcard or make a phone call that simply says, I am a voter, I am your constituent, and I demand that you support House Bill 1325 because asylum seekers need to work. And you can make that very simple statement. It's more compelling if you have a story to share. And the story could be literally anything. It might be you, because you might have a personal experience, a personal immigration story. It might be a friend or a neighbor or a colleague who you know has an immigration story. Or it might be the story that you heard today, that you know of an asylum seeker who suffered really needlessly, waiting for her work authorization. And you want to add to that story about the economics of it, right? Maybe you work for a company that's had an opening for months and months and months and can't fill the position. Maybe your spouse or your children or your aunts and uncles or anyone is in that situation. Maybe your favorite restaurant you've stopped going to because they don't have enough servers and it just takes too long to get your food. Or you need healthcare for a relative. So any personal story that tells both ends, right? The story of suffering, needless suffering, and the story of businesses that need help. So that's what you can put in your letter. And that would be in support of House Bill 1325, which I see the link to the actual text of that bill is in the chat. You can certainly save that. Alternatively, you can write a more general letter that implores Congress to not make it harder for asylum seekers, that tells the story that we've heard today, that it is already hard, that people don't leave their countries of origin because they think it would be fun. That, you know, the notion of trying to, quote unquote, discourage people from coming to the United States as if they are encouraged, is a ludicrous notion. And again, the way to make that compelling is either to tell your own story or your relative story, a colleague story, a neighbor's story, or the story that you heard today. But the important sentence in the beginning is, I am a voter, I am your constituent, and I want you to be supporting asylum seekers, not making it harder for them. So does anyone have any questions? And I see somebody shared their personal story. Both of my very elderly parents relied on immigrant workers to look after them in assisted living in the years before their deaths. They were kind and wonderful people. All of them were also pursuing higher education to be healthcare professionals. And we all know we desperately need healthcare professionals of literally every level. You know, assisted living nurses, physician's assistants, medical doctors, all of that we're short on. So, and I can even share with you my own son's story. My son is in Indiana and he had a healthcare emergency, needed emergency surgery on Monday, and the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away. And he was throwing up, feverish. His friend had to drive him 40 minutes in terrible pain. And he only had a 6-hour window because of the emergency. And he made it to hour 4, thankfully, and he got the surgery. He's okay. He's certainly privileged and not an immigrant. But why is the hospital 40 minutes away? Because we have a healthcare shortage. That's why. I mean, there should be a hospital right on every block, like a pizza shop. But there isn't enough staff. There isn't enough money. So, so there you have it. So does anyone have any questions about writing or calling legislators. Yes, HB 1325 is a federal bill. So for this one, we want to contact U.S. Congressperson and senators. Yes. There are Pennsylvania bills. There's one, and we can put it in the chat. It's about driver's licenses for immigrants. One of the things that people like Miss Mansaray, while you're waiting for asylum, you're not eligible for a driver's license, which is, again, ridiculous. And what ultimately ends up happening for a lot of people, you know, they need a driver's license. Maybe their child suddenly faints and they have to take them to the hospital. They can't afford an ambulance. So they throw them in the neighbor's car and they rush to the hospital. Maybe they have to get to the kid's school right away because there's an emergency. So what ultimately happens is people who are not eligible for driver's licenses drive anyway because it's an emergency. And then that not only messes up their immigration case, but it puts all of us in danger because they don't have a license because they've never been tested. They never, you know, so it just doesn't really make any sense. I think there are over 30 states, don't quote me because I'm not positive, but I believe that there are over 30 states who have gotten rid of this draconian, oh, if you're not documented, you can't have a driver's license rule. And so it's time that Pennsylvania kind of get with the program. So if you want to write to your state legislators, you can write about the Pennsylvania driver's license bill. And I'm hoping either Kathleen or Ellen can find it because I don't remember the name. Okay, and there is a question in the chat. Does HIAS ever arrange lobbying groups to visit local offices at federal legislators? So we rarely have the capacity to do that, but we work in coalition with lots of community-based organizations who often have lobbying days. And when they do, we try to broadcast them through our e-newsletter, which you can sign up for free, or on our Facebook page. So yes, and Dr. Gutman, yes, the emails and phone messages have equal weight in the tallies for what constituents are asking about. Yes. Oh, and thank you, Jordan. Jordan is this fabulous volunteer for us. He put the link in the chat for the driver's license. So if you want to do state, please feel free. Pennsylvania HB 769, driver's licenses for all. And if you want to do federal, again, you can write in favor of that specific bill, work authorization, or you can write about, please do not make it harder for asylum seekers. All right, other questions? So do we want to write together so you can ask questions as you're writing? Oh, and Ellen put in more information. Great. About driver's licenses. So if you want to write your own letter, please feel free to drop off, and thank you for attending. We're going to post the recording on our website probably in about a week or so. And otherwise, you're welcome to hang out and write with us, and I'm happy to give suggestions and answer questions as you write. So thanks.